Buongiorno. Hi. Guten Morgen. We're here in beautiful Brno with
Sara.
Sara. Sara, where are you from?
I'm from Egypt and I have a great passion for languages for as long as I can remember. And I speak 9 languages at different levels, and I have a background in psychology and neuroscience.
Which is a very important thing for what we're going to discuss today, because we've been talking about neuroscience, psychology, and language learning, and of course.
Exactly, yeah.
And the first question I have for you is as a language learner who's also a psychologist, is there anything that people have to know when it comes to psychology? What do you have to know about the human brain that can help a learner learn foreign languages better and more efficiently?
They are really connected. How psychology and neuroscience affect language learning, they're definitely connected, and I've been into that since I was a little child, thinking, and that's the reason why I studied psychology and neuroscience, because I always feel that there's a huge connection. Emotions play a huge part, because if you think about it, first of all, when you want to learn a language, your motivation and emotions not only affect your motivation, but they also actually affect the learning itself. So if you're connected with the language and the culture, and you actually you're invested in learning that language, this affects all your learning methods at the end. And also with memory, if you're connecting the memory, the words you're learning with memories and emotions, you never forget them. So emotions play a huge part in language learning.
Exactly. This is a big one because, for example, a lot of people learn with books and they think, okay, I learn a lot of words, I make lists. But the reality is that we learn by communicating with people, by having conversations, and through the good and the bad, right? I guess it has happened to you that you have embarrassing moments.
Yes. You remember them the best, actually. These ones you never forget.
Right?
I have a few of them, but yes.
Do you have anything in particular you remember? I mean, in my life, there's so many things. There are so many embarrassing but also emotional moments that I can't, remember a single one very clearly. But when people ask me this question, like Yusuf asked me before, but embarrassing, sometimes we see it as bad, but it's a learning moment, right?
Exactly, yeah. When you hear the word a person says and that you had an embarrassing moment with it, you remember it immediately. You don't even think about it. But now just remembering examples is not easy, but of course
exactly.
The actual moment, it changes how the brain works.
So you talked about emotions.
Because it goes directly to the emotions part, the amygdala in the brain, and it connects, the neurons there are strengthened, and it helps you remember the memories.
Speaking of emotions.
Yeah.
Okay, emotions impact also memory. So
deeply.
Deeply. So we talked, with Sara, we've been talking about declarative memory and procedural memory. So these are technical terms. We'll not get into the technicalities, but what do people have to know about declarative and procedural when it comes to language learning? Making lists of words versus forming sentences. Just to give an example. What is it that you do? How do you apply this knowledge?
Yeah, so basically declarative memory is the what, and the procedural memory is the how, and how, basically if we're thinking about how reading a book about riding a bike, that's the declarative memory, and procedural memory is actually riding the bike. So that's just a general example of the differences. What was the question again?
So the question is, how did this help you learn foreign languages? So how does knowing about how the brain works and psychology help you learn languages in terms of emotions, in terms of memory? For example, for a more precise question, how do you learn vocabulary, which is something that people love, they want to know. They really are thirsty for this piece of knowledge.
So going back to the declarative and procedural, basically just because you've heard someone say something doesn't mean that you can use it in sentences right away. So that's the difference that learners cannot easily see, and they are two different things in terms of how the brain works. And the best way, if you have a list of vocabulary that you want to learn, that's the worst method that you can do, is to have this list and try to remember it, because it never works. But you need to connect the words to something. You need context. You've already heard that maybe several times. When you put a word in context, the idea is that you put emotions to it. You put some personal connections, you personalize it, and then it makes sense. So when I use Anki, for example, to make my flashcards, I take my notes from my classes, but I take the exact examples I had with my teacher. And actually, there's something really interesting about this, that when I'm reading one vocab flashcard, I remember the 30 other that were in this conversation just because I remembered the whole conversation. And oh yeah, that's the day we were talking about that thing. And then your brain starts to remember everything else. And the thing about it is I'm like an advocate of spaced repetition, because the brain cannot just learn something and then retrieve it. That's like, it's not how it works. It takes a lot of time to consolidate a memory. So the first thing you see a word, it basically goes to your hippocampus. That's the place for forming new memories. And it has to be consolidated in order for you to recall it and get it back and say it. So in order for that to happen, first of all, sleep is very important. So if you spend 5 hours learning the language, the next day you may forget a lot of it. But if you space out your learning, so like just learn 5 words today, activate them again tomorrow and again and again and again, then you don't forget them easily. Because sleep, that's something that people forget about, but sleep, there has to be like the sleep part where you sleep on it and literally have it the next day come up more easier.
Exactly.
So that's also one thing. There's a lot that I can talk about. That's the thing. Like every time I'm starting to talk about something, then something else pops up. And,
of course.
Exactly.
When they say sleep on it, it's because the hippocampus transfers the information into the long-term memory, right? At night. That's why they say just learn a little bit before going to sleep. This is another piece of advice.
Exactly. And like the idea that neurons that fire together, wire together, the idea, the principle basically says that if you activate this word again, you're strengthening the neurons. So every time you reactivate the word, you're strengthening the neurons. And then basically you're strengthening this memory so that later on you don't easily forget it. But if you heard it only once, the brain is always cleaning up. So if you, it would say like this word is not important because they've only heard it once. It's not worth it. So the brain will just forget it and focus on the things that were strengthened and reactivated over time.
Absolutely. You teach Arabic, right?
Yeah, I do.
You teach Fusha or Egyptian Arabic or both?
Well, right now I'm focusing on Egyptian Arabic, but I've been teaching Fusha for a long time as well.
What's the name of?
LinguaZad. Yeah, I run LinguaZad, LinguaZad.com or on Instagram and YouTube. That's where I teach Arabic, Egyptian Arabic specifically, but I also answer all questions people have about the Arabic dialects and where is the starting point and all of that.
We'll put it in the description if you're interested in Egyptian Arabic. In fact, she made a wonderful presentation here in Brno talking about the difference between Fusha and it's true, in Egyptian Arabic. And in fact, it solved a lot of my doubts because I've been wanting to learn Arabic for a long time, and I've always been thinking, should I learn Fusha? Should I learn what dialect? So there was a lot of confusion, and as you know, if there's a lot of friction at the beginning, that derails any attempt to start. But now I have clarity, and I will start with Egyptian Arabic when the moment comes, maybe in a couple of years, because Arabic is an amazing, like all Arabic languages or related to Arabic are wonderful. I hear you guys speak. There's also a super nice guy behind
the camera, yeah. Yusuf.
Yes, Yusuf. Hi, Yusuf. And so the last question I wanted to ask you, so you're a language learner, you're a psychologist, but you're also a teacher, right? So how do you apply all this? So if I come to you as a complete beginner, right, and I say, hey, how should I start? Should I start from the script? Should I start from listening? What should I do?
I'm usually with speaking from day one, if you know the how. Like if you know how to speak from day one, you should do it. But if you're just completely unguided, then yeah, maybe it's not the best thing. But yeah, if you're learning with me directly, then definitely I know what I'm doing. And from the first class, we're speaking. I basically try to, because language acquisition is different than language learning, so I try to help you figure out the pattern of the language by asking you questions. So that's kind of like coaching perspective to learning.
So how would you start? What would you tell me?
Oh, you just want to do it right now?
Just 1 second. So how would you start?
Right. So, for example, I could say the word is name, right? And then you can add that ending to make it my name, your name, etc. So it's a possessive ending. So
let's do it. I'm just
exactly. So let's start. So you would say Ismi Luca.
Ismi Luca.
Exactly. Ismi Luca.
Luca.
Exactly.
Ismi Luca.
Ismi.
Ismi or with B?
With the E.
And the
You're saying it correctly. I'm just giving you the idea that it's
Ismi
Luca.
Which
so is the name.
Which is great because you learn the components of
also
everything.
Visually, it really matters when I'm showing everything on the screen. Then it helps way more because that's also another thing about neuroscience that you have to like activate. Like if you look
Of
at
course.
something, like the
The
visual.
more senses.
Also, the learning styles are different. People have like auditory or visual learning style, but most people are in between. So if you combine everything, that's the best.
exactly right.
So yeah, what I'm saying is that you have the word ism and then e, then you
Ism.
made ismi Luca.
Ismi.
And
What
if
about-
we say
what's your
that,
name?
yeah, if you say ek is ik. Sorry, let's use the feminine version. Ik is the ending for you. So you know the word for name,
It's for you, yes.
ism, and ik.
Esek.
Is-
Esek.
Ism, ik.
Esmek.
Ismik.
Esmek is your name. Like, okay, Esmek.
So you would say ismi.
Esmi, Luca. Esmek.
Sara.
Sara.
Yes.
Sara. Say
Sara.
it again. Sara. Sara.
Ismik Sara.
Esmek, Sara. Oh, but that's a question. You are Sara.
You are
What
Sara.
about what's your name?
Yes. So instead of Sara, that's the answer, right? We need to remove that and put the question, okay? Which is a.
E. Sara's.
So ismik stays the same, and then you put the a.
Esmek E.
Ismik a.
Esmek E.
Ismik a.
Esmek E.
Exactly.
What's your name, right?
Yes,
Esmek E.
ismik a would be what's your name.
Esmi Sara.
yeah,
Esmek E. Esmi Luca.
we're
right?
already picking up on a pattern where the answer goes where the question is.
Exactly.
So you don't change the
Question,
order.
answer. Okay.
Exactly. So ismik a, ismi Sara. So the order, like from the first sentence, you're now like, I don't have to explicitly explain that in class, but students already see the pattern coming up.
Of course.
So we're basically exchanging a word and like, then the question comes at the end.
Right.
So that's basically how it works. But I
Pattern
think,
recognition.
Pattern recognition.
Pattern recognition. This is just
Implicitly or explicitly,
Implicitly or
but
explicitly.
without like learning you learn grammar, but through conversations.
you learn grammar through language, as
Through- yeah.
Kato Lombo or Lom Kato used to say. She's a famous polyglot that said that.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank
yeah.
you. So you can find, if you ever decide to learn Egyptian Arabic, you can find LinguaZad, you can find Sara. She's a wonderful teacher, a wonderful language learner, and a wonderful linguist and psychologist. So
Thank
get
you
the
so
best of
much.
the best. Have a nice day. Ciao, ciao.